It's the early 1970s. A time of exploration, a time of war, a time of change and dynamic shift in culture. From Elton John, Bob Dylan, and Glenn Campbell to an international oil crisis, the 1970s was a period of technological advancements where interest paved the way to efficiency, and a desire to know more kicked open the doors to innovation. Among these, in 1972, another great innovation would be revealed to the world: the video game. From 1972 to 1983, this period would be known as the first generation of video gaming, commonly referred to as the Pong Wars.
When you think of computers, you might think of your standard laptop, but in the 50s and 60s, computers were the size of full university classrooms, like mainframe computers. The history of computers alone would be worth its own documentary, but that's not the purpose of this episode. Instead, we are going to focus on the history of gaming, starting way back in the 1950s with the first electronic game, Bertie the Brain. Bertie was the brainchild of Dr. Joseph Kates, a European engineer that was credited not only with Bertie the Brain, but also the first automated traffic signaling system. This game was basically you versus the computer in a classic game of tic-tac-toe. It was showcased once at the Canadian National Exposition, and then unfortunately it was lost to time. This would also hold true for the Nimrod, which played the classic game of Nim. But again, these were very, very primitive approaches at having an interactive experience with a computer. This would be proven time and time again with computer titles such as Draughts on the Ferrante Mark I, or even OXO made for the EDSAC computer. But the true ability of someone to play a game with what might remotely resemble modern video game graphics would be Tennis for Two, released in 1958.
When we say released, we really mean in a dark, quiet room at the Brookhaven National Laboratory on a dusty Donner Model 30 analog computer, with the output being on an oscilloscope. What was so unique about it was the computer was able to calculate trajectory, and with two controllers, players could move around an almost invisible racket to knock back the ball. You can see here in the footage, it's very difficult to understand what's going on. In addition to this, not a few years later, a phenomenal computer title known as Space War was developed by Harvard employees Martin Greets, Steve Russell, and Wayne Wheaton on the PDP-1. Essentially, it was a dogfight between two spaceships with a randomly generated background. The graphics were rather reminiscent of Atari's Asteroids, but this was years before. As with all these titles, many of them faded into obscurity, but as time went on, the question of how can we bring electronic games home started to be pondered, and a few different folks had the answer.
It's the 60s, and technology is booming. You might not know, but many things were born in the 60s, things like computer mice, LEDs, Unix, and more importantly, the first ever video game console. But it wasn't out yet. It was only a concept at the time. In fact, the man behind the system started thinking about it way back in 1951. This man was Ralph Baer, and his idea would lay the framework for all video game history as we know it. In 1951, Baer considered the idea while he was building a television at the place of his employment, but he wasn't able to act on it until working as the chief engineer and manager of the Equipment Design Division at Sanders Associates a whole 15 years later in 1966. It was then that Baer was able to create a prototype that was worthy enough of gathering capital for future development. The game would produce a single dot and Could we imagine if that dot were shootable? Let's add a firearm. And with a little bit of technological innovation, they were able to produce not one, not two, but 3 dots. This was significant because with these 3 dots, they'd be able to make a ball and 2 pedals. It was ping pong, and it was time to patent the idea.
With a patent in hand, it would be time to pitch it to the public. But they had a unique problem. Sanders Associates was a military defense contractor, like Raytheon or Lockheed Martin. In other words, they weren't the kind of people who would mass-produce video games, but instead, instruments of war. Baer and Sanders would reach out to RCA, but to no avail. However, a company known as Magnavox would take an interest in the console, leading to an agreement to design and release the Magnavox Odyssey in 1972.
Let's go back in time for a second. Innovation is not usually limited to a single person. The truth is, many people have fantastic ideas. More often than not, it's a race to see who can execute an idea first. But who could possibly compete with Magnavox's newest console? The answer? Nolan Bushnell. Long before the Odyssey was in the public light, Nolan Bushnell was a student at the University of Utah, and in his own time worked at Lagoon Amusement Park. While studying at the University of Utah, he witnessed Space War and thought it would be an amazing arcade title. Up to this time, most arcade games were electromechanical games, or games of skill, and very early attempts at commercialized pinball. But what if Space War could hop to the arcade spectrum? Nolan spoke about this idea to his office mate, Ted Dabney, and the two began working on making this monumental leap, but it failed. The truth is, the PDP-1 computer was about $120,000, and microcomputers were not that much cheaper at the time. By the time 1970 rolled around, the concept was dead in the ground. Then one day, Bushnell saw an advertisement for a much cheaper microcomputer, the Digital General Nova, which sold for roughly $8,000 per unit. The duo began working to create a prototype, and even brought on Larry Bryan to act as a computer programmer. This team together would be known as Syzygy, a crazy name that is an astronomical term for when the planets align, which, for all involved, is likely how it felt trying to make this idea come to life. Even on the Nova, the project was still not feasible. But like we mentioned earlier, innovation is not usually limited to a single person, and Bushnell was no exception. The project was rocky, but Syzygy decided that if you can't make a computer run a game, then why not just make hardware that could run the game? And so they began designing Computer Wars, the first commercially available arcade title.
The age-old question of, I have a box, now how do I sell it, was on Bushnell's mind, specifically during a dentist visit in 1971. Bushnell expressed concern about releasing this game he had been working on, and ironically the dentist knew a sales manager for Nutting Associates based out of Mountain View, California. Nutting was already previously successful for their analog quiz game Computer Quiz, and was looking for an opportunity to expand their success. After plenty of red tape and contractual agreements, Syzygy and Nutting Associates released the first commercially available arcade game, Computer Wars, a derivative of Space Wars, in December of 1971. From the early years of electronic entertainment, there was an opportunity to get cheap cash. Pinball machines, primitive electronic games, and slot machines found themselves embedded in hotel lobbies, bars, and in some cases even funeral parlors, all with the intention of making easy money. But once it was discovered that the arcade game could be so much more, Nolan Bushnell had another idea. Where Bushnell would be inspired by Space War to create Computer Wars, he would witness the Odyssey and be inspired to work on a game that replicated table tennis. This game would be known as Pong, but not before changing the name of the company from Syzygy to Atari. Bushnell would ask Alan Alcorn to develop the game, but he had zero experience with creating video games. Thanks to Atari's previous experiences with electronics and transistor logic, Alcorn was able to begin working on Pong. But it had a critical defect. When the ball was served, it would gradually increase speed, but if the player missed, the speed would reset. This would become a key component to the difficulty of Pong, and by combining a sync generator and a Hitachi television, the prototype for Pong was created.
Initially, it was only placed in Andy Capp's tavern, which Atari at the time had a promising business relationship with as suppliers of pinball machines. This was done courtesy of Bally Manufacturing, who had a $4,000 a month contract with Atari to produce pinball machines. Bushnell's idea was that Pong could be a viable inclusion to the contract, but Bally was iffy about it. The truth is, Bushnell and Dabney had no remote interest in continuing to work with the pinball license, and this was their way out. But inside of Atari, trouble was brewing. A patent that involved a video circuit, which was invented dually by Bushnell and Dabney, didn't have Dabney's name on it at all. A year later, Dabney would leave Atari, selling his portion of the company for $250,000. Time itself had long forgotten the contributions of Ted Dabney, but Bushnell and Alcorn would go down in history for both turbulent business practices and one of the greatest consoles of its era. Sadly, it was plagued with a crippling effect on the game industry as we know it. As the late 70s rolled around, Atari was breaking into the home console market with their home version of Pong. Of course, it had its own issues, such as a high visibility lawsuit with Magnavox that crippled a few companies. But we'll cover that in a second. It's important to know that even more companies were entering the competitive arcade market, competing with titles such as Asteroids and Missile Command. Companies such as Jack of all trades Taito with Space Invaders, pinball extraordinaries Stern Electronics and Williams Entertainment with titles such as Berserk and Defender, and a Japanese treasure, Nintendo, who would release Donkey Kong at the end of the generation.
All in all, these formative experiments in the arcade would pave the road to what would be known as the golden age of the arcade. We aren't exactly there yet, but a few important names will be entering the battlefield. Make sure to pay attention to that crazy monkey tossing barrels. Nintendo didn't know it at the time, but he's about to become much, much bigger. The rest? They will play a pivotal role in the brightest and, unfortunately, the darkest time in video game history. While we addressed the history of some of these companies, at least the ones that mattered, we want to paint the landscape of video game history by presenting some of the consoles that were created during this time of innovation. Bear in mind, there were at least 800 known first-generation consoles, so for the purposes of this episode, we're only going to talk about the ones that made the biggest impact, starting with Magnavox.
Much of the history of Magnavox has already been covered, so ultimately talking about the classic release of the Odyssey again would be repetitive and unnecessary. The Odyssey was released in 1972, selling 69,000 units upon its release and 350,000 units by the time it was discontinued in 1975. What many people fail to realize is that while the Odyssey was the father of the generation, it did inevitably spawn its own family of titles known as the Magnavox Odyssey series. These were unique because they did not incorporate the same chip that many other companies would rely on, the AY3-8500. Well, at least not for some time anyway. Instead, they utilized specific Texas Instruments chips. Another thing you might not know about is that in 1974, Magnavox was acquired by Philips. Therefore, on some occasions, you might see Philips Odysseys as opposed to Magnavox Odysseys. The family, again, was simple. The Magnavox 100 through 500 were all basic Pong machines. They featured the ability to use 6 C-cell batteries or a 9-volt power supply. As the unit evolved, certain aspects were changed. The 100 and 200 had an onboard scoring mechanic based around a slider, and the sounds were centric to the machine itself. The 300 was where Magnavox finally broke down to use the AY3-8500 chip, and because of it, onboard scoring was now possible. Additionally, they pulled the accessory knobs off, leaving only the up and down ability, versus the crazy diagonal knobs like before.
But after the release of the system, TI would develop their own chip that could produce onboard scoring. The 400 and the 500 were also the same. The exception was that the 500 could produce color graphics. After this, Magnavox slowly started working away from the same specific style of presentation for the Odyssey series. The final entry to look like the original style would be the 2000, and again it was a duplicate in the style of the Magnavox 300, using the AY3-8500 chip. Another key unique entry would be the Odyssey 4305, which was a 19-inch color television with a built-in Odyssey 300 or 500 unit within, and it had wired controllers.
Moving on, The final two entries in the family were dramatically different in appearance, with the 3000 featuring detachable paddles and the 4000 featuring oddly familiar controllers that would foreshadow the plans of a new console that would be on the market. In the next few years, it would pave the way for an ambitious and unique approach to the next generation of gaming.
Epoch has a rich history in Japan as a toy maker, way back in 1958, and being one of the most successful toy makers creates the opportunity to venture into other industries, such as the video game industry. In 1975, they reached out to Magnavox to help create a home Pong console, leading to the release of the TV tennis Electro Tennis. This gem, while obscure, set the framework in a few ways in the Japanese video game market. First and foremost, when you consider how the Magnavox Odyssey was the first game console in the United States, the TV tennis Electro Tennis was the first video game console in Japan. It was also potentially the first wireless video game console ever invented, utilizing the television's UHF antenna to pick up the signal generated by the unit. It was massively successful depending on what sources you read. Some say 10,000, some say 3 million. But what we do know is that this console was the pioneer of gaming in Japan.
Epoch didn't stop there, however, and released highly obscure consoles that fit the bill for the Pong craze, such as the Epoch TV Game System 10, the Epoch TV Baseball, as well as the Epoch TV Block, a derivative of Breakout with 7 different styles of Breakout. In fact, most, if not all of their consoles related to popular arcade games at the time. The meat and bones of their existence stem from Pong, Breakout, and eventually Taito's Space Invaders, with the latter being the final entry in their first-generation library known as the Epoch TV Vader. Epoch was without a doubt a national treasure in Japan. They were a household name because of their consoles in the 70s, and even with Nintendo releasing their take on the generational standards, Epoch was still pulling slightly ahead of them, and this was only the beginning of their cultural outreach, as they had only scraped the surface of culture with their influence.
Very soon, 3 major occurrences would happen. They would plan to release the first Japanese programmable console, break out into the handheld game market, and meet a familiar friend named Doraemon.
We've already talked about the history of Pong, but when we consider the home presence of Pong, then we obviously need to start with none other than Home Pong. Pong was a massive hit in the arcades, and Nolan Bushnell wanted to push to bring this arcade system home. This resulted in Harold Lee, an Atari engineer, working on the concept of the original run of Home Pong. But it was no easy feat. Retailers at the time of conception felt the idea was going to be too expensive and not interesting to consumers. This was a challenge met by 2 key Atari employees, Gene Lipkin and Al Alcorn. From the conception of the idea, Atari was turned down time and time again by various consumer electronic companies. Even with a public appearance of Home Pong at the New York Toy Fair in 1975, Atari couldn't pull off a deal. A popular company, Tandy, who was setting the standard of electronic sales courtesy of Radio Shack, wasn't interested. Eventually, Gene Lipkin happened to call Sears, who of course said no. But one of the interesting aspects of Sears is that each department had a say in what was sold. Gene Lipkin called Sears departments one by one and consistently had the phone hung up on him. But eventually he connected with a man named Tom Quinn, who of all places worked in Sears' sporting goods department, not the TV electronics department. And believe it or not, Quinn was interested.
One of the key reasons why Quinn was so interested was because Magnavox was losing money on a deal with Sears. Not because it was unsuccessful, but instead because Magnavox's sales strategy with Sears was to provide an Odyssey with every Magnavox television sold. The problem existed when people were buying more televisions than the number of consoles being produced. If you had no Odyssey, you had no ability to sell Magnavox televisions, which means that sales were falling short and beneath the quota for Sears. This was the perfect opportunity for Atari to embed themselves in history. and they did so at Sears corporate headquarters to show it off to the corporate heads, who were impressed. But even through all of that, there was tons of red tape. Quinn wanted 150,000 units, whereas Bushnell only anticipated being able to release about 75,000. Thanks to some creative investments, Atari was able to find a supplier for their original run of the Atari home console, known as the Sears Telegames Home Pong, before finally creating their own run of the console in 1976. But it would be a disservice to avoid talking about Magnavox and Atari's shaky relationship professionally in the video game industry. The truth is, Magnavox sat back and watched the Pong craze explode throughout the 70s, and eventually bit down on the opportunity to bring companies to court. Atari wasn't the only company in the crosshairs, however, as Bally Midway, Chicago Dynamics, and Allied Leisure were also included in their mass lawsuit concerning the origins of Pong. Fundamentally, Pong was derivative of the format that Magnavox used with their Odyssey. Well, kind of. There's a lot of gray areas with it. Regardless, the lawsuits pushed forward, and with Atari backed into a corner, it was either time to pay the legal fees to counteract Magnavox, which would have been $1.5 million, far above what the company was worth, or pay a licensing fee of $700,000 to Magnavox, of which Nolan Bushnell chose the latter. This is likely the only move that kept the name Atari relevant. One of the companies wasn't so lucky. Chicago Coin's TV Ping Pong in 1973 was made literally a year after the Odyssey's release and led to the dissolution of Chicago Coin. The remaining assets would end up being purchased by a company known as Stern Electronics, a forefather of the pinball industry.
Atari recovered from the licensing loss fairly well and had plans to build a console that would rival anything in the arcades by bringing more than just Pong home, and instead would focus on bringing the entire arcade straight to consumers.
Coleco. Bringers of joy and competitor to Mattel, this company has an interesting start. Before they were making consumer electronics and even toys, they were making leather. That's what Coleco stands for, the Connecticut Leather Company. Now, we could easily discuss their roots from leather to toys, but the relevant part to this video is the decision in 1976 to break into the video game world. This was done by the way of the infamous AY38500 chip. If you had one of these, you could easily break into the video game world and frustrate the likes of Magnavox to no end. Their first console would simply be named the Coleco Telstar, the first in their line of consoles. It featured 3 games: hockey, handball, and tennis. It had 2 fixed paddles, which became the standard for the next 2 entries, named the Telstar Classic and Deluxe. Fundamentally, they were the same. The only change would be in aesthetics. In 1977, the same year the Deluxe released, Coleco mixed it up with the Telstar Ranger, incorporating 2 light gun games with the console, Skeet and Target, in addition to the standard Pong titles, tennis, hockey, jai-alai, and handball.
Most of Coleco's Telstar line was the same, unfortunately, and they were major components in ensuring a consistent saturation of the first generation of gaming. This potentially foreshadowed the direction the market would head in the early 80s, at the end of this generation. To describe each console would be the same thing 14 different times. They all played the same titles. The only difference was literally the casing that surrounded it, and if it had color or sound that originated within the console itself. The outliers would be Coleco Telstar Combat, which has these unique tank controls, and Coleco Telstar Arcade, which utilized cartridges and was one of the wackiest looking consoles to date. It had driving, it had shooting, and of course, it had Pong.
All in all, these endeavors paved the way to a close call with bankruptcy in 1980. Luckily, they were able to avoid that and would begin working on a system to go up against a major giant in the gaming industry, Mattel Electronics.
When you think of Nintendo, you likely only think of the NES, the gray box that brought us time-cherished titles, such as The Legend of Zelda. But as we mentioned before, the history of Nintendo is deeply embedded in Japanese culture, from Hanafuda carts to consumer electronics and even love hotels. Nintendo did it all. Their first commercial venture into the world of video gaming would come from real-world events in entertainment, as well as international issues. Taito had just released Space Invaders, which was captivating the world by storm, and due to the oil crisis of 1973, toys were expensive to produce. So, at the time, it was more cost-effective to create games in the arcade spectrum, which they did with Sheriff, Space Fever, and a few other unremarkable titles. But when Atari released Pong in 1975, everyone and their brother was scrambling to make Pong clones. Nintendo was no exception. This manifested as a license request to Magnavox to be able to create Pong-like games. Heading into the late 70s, Nintendo worked with Mitsubishi to release their first video game system, the Color TV Game 6. Retailing for 9,700 yen, this little box was a Pong clone with 6 derivatives. It's a simple concept and incredibly hard to come by. A mere week later, it was improved upon with the Color TV Game 15. Essentially, it was a release of the original console, and in theory had 15 games, but it was really just 6 games with individual variations. Another cool thing to consider is that Nintendo had a really great relationship with Sharp, and they did some production runs of the Color TV series as well, with Sharp's edition of the 6 being dark orange, and their white version of the 15 known as the Color TV Game XG115.
2 years later, much like Coleco, Nintendo wanted to incorporate the racing element into their home consoles. This led to the creation of the Color TV Game Racing 112. This is a pretty cool piece of hardware that you can play with the center steering wheel or detach the 2 paddles on the side for a 2-player experience, and with all the combinations you could have 112 varieties of gameplay. It looks a lot like Taito's Street Racer, but in the 70s, copyright infringement was only a whisper on the wind. It took a lot of time and a lot of money to prove that somebody stole your idea, so more than often, these lawsuits didn't happen. The second to last console created in this lineage of titles would be the Color TV game block Kozushi, released a year later for 13,500 yen. Whereas the older systems were made with the assistance of Mitsubishi, this console was made exclusively by Nintendo, and as a point of interest, the case for the console was created by a lowly apprentice artist by the name of Shigeru Miyamoto. As the name of the console implies, this time Nintendo was tackling Breakout, and this console essentially was a mirror image of a clone of Breakout that Nintendo released in the arcades known as Block Fever. Comparing these right now, you can see the similarities, and in conjunction with that, Epoch had just released a block-breaking game as well, so at this time we are starting to build the framework for Japanese game developers in both a positive and negative light.
The final entry by Nintendo in this line of consoles would be the Computer TV game, which is a very rare console that was designed by Miyamoto. It was a true-to-form arcade port of Computer Othello, the first game developed and published by Nintendo. The Computer name would carry on to the next console Nintendo would want to create, a computer for families. So, there you have it, the first generation of gaming. A time where everyone focused on making the same thing, trying to outdo their competitors. Magnavox introduced a concept, and Atari ran with it, as did APF, Bandai, Commodore, Audiosonic, Tomy, Tandy, Interon, and a bunch of other obscure companies. As we enter the door into the second generation of gaming, these companies would diverge and attempt to forge their own paths, with no realization of the implications it would cause on this new market. Where the industry grew and built a wall so quickly, the mortar would slowly collapse, and the wall would crash, forever changing the industry as we knew it.